The hearing room froze. Kash Patel leaned forward, eyes narrowed, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. "Liar," he said, dragging the word out just long enough for every microphone to catch it. The sound bounced off the paneled walls, through the lenses of cameras, and into the bloodstream of the internet. Within seconds, phones lit up. Clips spread across feeds like wildfire, each replayed, remixed, recaptioned for maximum outrage. For a split second, you could feel the collective gasp. Staffers turned to each other, reporters scribbled, and Patel leaned back, satisfied. It wasn't just an insult, it was a performance, a challenge broadcast live to millions who had already chosen sides. He smiled, thinking he'd seized control of the moment. But across the table, Representative Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. No visible anger, no stumble, no desperate grab for words. She just looked at him, steady and unblinking, as if studying a man who had just declared war on his own credibility. Her silence wasn't weakness, it was strategy. The cameras caught that too. Outside the chamber, headlines erupted. Patel calls Congresswoman a liar on live TV. Clash explodes in hearing room. Comment sections filled with fire. Supporters cheered the spectacle, critics called it disgraceful. And through it all, Crockett said nothing. That restraint, that calm, began to tell its own story. Narration threads through the chaos. In a world addicted to noise, composure is rebellion. Every glare from Patel, every echo of that single word, only amplified the contrast between arrogance and dignity. Somewhere, viewers paused mid-scroll, sensing that what they were seeing wasn't just another political shouting match. It was the collision of two Americas, the one that shouts and the one that listens. The clip would loop endlessly, dissected by pundits and podcasters, until even Patel's allies wondered if he'd gone too far. Yet behind the scenes, something else was already moving. While Patel basked in his moment, Jasmine Crockett was gathering what he never expected. Proof. The internet thought the confrontation had peaked. They were wrong, because what happened in the next 48 hours would turn a televised insult into a career-ending catastrophe. It began as just another oversight hearing. Another long day of questions, posturing, and sound bites packaged for partisan feeds. But this one carried a particular electricity. The stakes were national. Cameras lined the back wall, anchors whispered into earpieces, and millions tuned in live. The hearing was supposed to examine accountability and ethics within government operations. But everyone knew it would become something else entirely, a theater of ideology. Kash Patel entered the room first, surrounded by aides and confidants. He wore that polished half-smirk, familiar to anyone who'd watched his cable appearances, the look of a man who believed he could bend any conversation to his will. For years, he had perfected that blend of swagger and grievance, turning every question into a monologue, every critique into a rallying cry. To his supporters, he was a warrior. To his critics, a provocateur who mistook volume for virtue. Either way, Patel was ready for his next viral moment. Jasmine Crockett, by contrast, arrived quietly, carrying a stack of color-coded folders and the calm that unnerves men who mistake stillness for softness. Her reputation preceded her, precise, unflappable, allergic to theatrics. She was not a celebrity politician. She was a lawyer who had built her career on facts, not flash. Her staffers whispered that she could cite case law like other people recite song lyrics. But what mattered most was that she never entered a room unprepared. And on that day, her preparation would matter more than anyone could imagine. The contrast between them was cinematic. Patel radiating defiance, Crockett radiating composure. Even before the first question, pundits on opposing networks framed the scene with bias baked in. A veteran political fighter facing off with a freshman lawmaker, one headline read. The subtext was clear. He was the star, she was the supporting act. But quiet people often rewrite the script. As questioning began, Patel spoke with practiced aggression. He leaned on familiar buzzwords, broad accusations, and moral outrage packaged for social media clips. He wasn't there to answer questions. He was there to perform authority. Each sentence was engineered to dominate airtime, to feed his online base. Yet behind his rhetoric was a subtle nervousness, a sense that maybe this time, the cameras weren't entirely on his side. Crockett listened. She let him talk. She took notes, while others fidgeted. Her eyes didn't wander. Her posture never shifted. She didn't interrupt. She didn't need to. Every moment he spent talking without substance only widened the gap between performance and principle. Viewers at home noticed the difference. In comment sections and group chats, the conversation began to shift. Why isn't she reacting? Why does she look so calm? What does she know that he doesn't? That tension built minute by minute. When Patel finally turned his attention toward her, The room seemed to anticipate something explosive. He thought her composure was submission. He mistook her silence for lack of ammunition. But Crockett had seen that kind of arrogance before. Men who underestimated her in courtrooms, debates, and interviews, only to watch their confidence dissolve under the weight of their own words. As the exchanges grew sharper, Patel's tone hardened. He interrupted repeated accusations, tried to provoke her into a soundbite of her own. But Crockett's restraint was unnerving. She spoke only when necessary, each word measured, deliberate, factual, and the more measured she became, the more his aggression looked like desperation. By midday, the coverage had turned. Commentators replayed clips side by side, Patel's fury against Crockett's poise. Hashtags like #composure is power began surfacing. Even neutral outlets began to question the imbalance. One anchor noted, "You can almost see the moment he realizes he's losing the room." Patel didn't notice. He thought dominance was volume. He thought control came from cutting someone off mid-sentence. He had no idea that the real power in that room was silence. The silence of someone who knew she had the truth, and the receipts to prove it. The audience didn't yet know what was coming, but Crockett did. Somewhere beneath that polished calm sat a folder filled with facts that would shatter his narrative. The cameras were still rolling, and Patel was still talking, unaware that his own words were digging the hole deeper. The confrontation wasn't over. It was only loading. And what no one realized, Crockett had receipts, and she wasn't done. Before that hearing, before the cameras caught his smirk and the word that would echo across the internet, Kash Patel had already lived several political lifetimes. He wasn't just a man walking into a congressional showdown. He was a product of the political machine that had trained him to mistake aggression for influence. Years earlier, he was an ambitious staffer, working late nights in the halls of power, learning quickly that truth was optional, but loyalty was currency. He rose through the ranks not because he outworked others, but because he outshouted them. Television producers loved him. He was the kind of guest who guaranteed fireworks. Every panel he joined turned into a spectacle. Every question an opportunity to perform indignation. He discovered something addictive in those green room lights. Validation that came not from ideas, but from applause. He realized outrage sold faster than nuance, and that facts could be edited for emotional effect. Before long, he wasn't chasing policy wins. He was chasing retweets, headlines, and the next viral clip. Each confrontation made him a little bolder. Each cheer from his audience a little louder. The more extreme the take, the bigger the invitation count. In those early interviews, he was charming, quick, almost disarmingly confident. He spoke in absolutes, never maybe, never perhaps. People crave certainty, and he offered it by the bucket. For a moment, he believed he had cracked the code of modern politics. Sound outrun substance. Conviction outrun compassion. He could craft a narrative out of thin air and make half the country believe it. But somewhere along that climb, something changed. The boundary between defending a belief and manipulating it blurred. Facts became suggestions, narratives became weapons, and every disagreement turned into a test of dominance. Off-camera colleagues described him as intense, even brilliant, but addicted to control. He didn't just want to win arguments. He wanted to humiliate the other side. That hunger, that taste for domination, became the heartbeat of his brand. There were warning signs, moments when his confidence tipped toward arrogance. Once, a senior advisor pulled him aside after a televised clash that went too far. "You're good," she said, "but you're playing a dangerous game." Eventually, people stopped cheering and start watching. He laughed it off. To him, criticism was proof he was winning. His strategy was simple: provoke, polarize, and repeat. The louder he was, the more attention he received. And attention meant relevance. He learned how to turn minor policy debates into culture war moments, how to weaponize half-truths for full outrage. Each appearance, each quote, was calibrated to feed the algorithm. His followers called him fearless. His detractors called him reckless. In his mind, both were compliments. When opportunities came, he seized them ruthlessly. He wrote books, launched podcasts, built an image of the unflinching insider who told it like it is. But the truth was subtler. He told it as it needed to sound for him to stay in the spotlight. The higher he rose, the more insulated he became. Few dared challenge him directly, because his retaliation was swift and public. He had mastered the art of turning opponents into villains before they could do the same to him. It worked for years. He was invited onto panels, into rallies, into closed-door meetings, where strategy blurred with spectacle. But beneath the surface, the cracks had already begun. His talking points started looping, his certainty curdling into cynicism. In private, even allies whispered that he had become a caricature of himself. A man who no longer believed half the things he said but had to keep saying them because silence would mean irrelevance. That was his unspoken fear, irrelevance. For a man like Patel, silence was death. The machine he built demanded constant noise, constant friction. The applause had to continue, or it would all fall apart, so he doubled down. When controversy erupted, he leaned in. When challenged, he attacked harder. It wasn't about winning arguments anymore. It was about never appearing to lose. By the time he sat across from Jasmine Crockett in that hearing room, he had perfected the persona. Every gesture, every smirk, every accusatory phrase was part of the same playbook he'd used for years. Dominate the space, control the tone, own the headlines. He expected the same result as always: a viral clip, a round of praise, another round of bookings. But something in that room was different. The audience wasn't the same. The country wasn't the same. People were tired. The noise that had once entertained now felt exhausting. And across from him sat someone who embodied the opposite of everything his brand relied on: quiet, truth, and preparation. He didn't see it then, but the dynamic had already shifted. For the first time, his performance didn't land as power, it landed as desperation. The rhythm of outrage that had once fueled his rise was beginning to sound hollow. The crowd that had once cheered him was starting to notice the repetition, the lack of depth, the vanity in his conviction. Yet Patel couldn't stop. Habit had hardened into instinct. When he saw Crockett's calm expression, he mistook it for weakness. Same mistake he'd made with every opponent who refused to match his noise. He didn't realize that stillness can be the sharpest weapon. There's an old saying in politics: the louder the defense, the weaker the position. Patel had lived by the inverse. He believed loudness was strength. It had always worked before, but every empire built on noise eventually meets silence. And Crockett was about to deliver it, before the cameras, before the congressional title, before the headlines. Jasmine Crockett was simply the daughter of a working-class family who believed that truth didn't need a microphone. It needed courage. She grew up in a neighborhood where dignity was currency and noise was just background. Her parents taught her early that respect is earned twice over when you're a black woman in rooms that weren't built for you. They didn't have power or privilege, but they had conviction, and that became her inheritance. As a child, she spoke softly, but thought deeply. Teachers often mistook her quiet for shyness, but it was calculation. She watched, learned, and spoke only when she knew her words would land. By high school, that silence had turned into a kind of strength. While others rushed to be noticed, she was studying how power actually worked, who got to speak, who got interrupted, and how truth could be drowned in volume. She saw the pattern early, and she vowed to break it. In college, she was the one who raised her hand when the room went tense. She debated professors twice her age, challenged unjust policies, and organized when others hesitated. But still, people underestimated her. They saw her warmth and mistook it for naivety. They heard her measured tone and assumed compliance. What they didn't see was the discipline behind that calm. The long nights, the endless reading, the quiet certainty that she could outwork anyone who doubted her. Law school hardened her resolve. She learned the power of precision, the weight of every word on the record. In moot court, she didn't shout her arguments. She dismantled her opponents with logic so sharp it made noise unnecessary. Her classmates called her the storm in slow motion. When others performed, she prepared. That distinction would follow her for the rest of her life. Her first cases as a young public defender tested everything she believed about justice. She represented people who didn't have connections, who couldn't afford the luxury of mistakes. She sat across from prosecutors who towered over her, men twice her age with smirks that said, "You don't belong here." They expected nerves, submission, maybe even tears, but they got precision instead. Every case she won wasn't just a legal victory, it was a personal manifesto. Composure could be revolutionary. There was one case that would define her. A young man accused of something he didn't do. The evidence was thin, the odds stacked, the room full of prejudice disguised as professionalism. Mid-trial, the opposing counsel raised his voice, mocked her experience, called her emotional. The room laughed. For a heartbeat, she felt the heat of humiliation rise. Then she took a breath. Instead of reacting, she flipped through her notes and said calmly, "Emotion doesn't lose cases, evidence does." The silence that followed was her first true victory. The jury leaned in. The balance shifted. She won that trial not because she was loud, but because she refused to become what they expected. That was the day she learned restraint is the ultimate power. From there, her career built itself around integrity and grit. She moved from courtroom battles to public service, not chasing fame, but chasing fairness. She didn't crave the spotlight. It followed her, slowly, reluctantly, drawn to the gravitational pull of authenticity. Constituents trusted her because she listened. Colleagues respected her because she did her homework. Even those who disagreed with her found her impossible to dismiss. Still, with every step upward came another round of doubt. Commentators described her as polished but untested. Donors asked if she was ready for the big stage. Some said she was too composed to connect. Others said too assertive to be likable. The contradictions were endless, but they all said the same thing: know your place. And every time she heard it, she smiled quietly and let her work speak louder than the noise. Behind the calm was a lifetime of practice. Decades of being talked over, interrupted, underestimated. Each moment was training for what would come later. So when the day arrived that she'd sit across from a man like Kash Patel, a man who thrived on provocation and spectacle, she didn't need a script. She'd already lived the rehearsal. The morning of the hearing, she looked over her notes one last time. Every fact verified, every question prepared. She knew who she was walking into that room with, a man built by the outrage economy, addicted to disruption. But she also knew who she was. Not a performer, not a pundit, but a servant of truth. She wasn't there to win applause. She was there to stand her ground. The lights were hot, the air thick with anticipation. Patel entered, flanked by cameras and confidence. Crockett followed, her demeanor so calm it seemed to absorb the tension. She had seen this kind of energy before, the type that confuses arrogance for authority. She'd faced louder men before, men who shouted to feel powerful. But this time, the whole world was watching as the hearing began. She could sense what was coming: the bait, the interruptions, the performance designed to rattle her composure. Yet she stayed anchored. Every insult, every smirk, every attempt to dominate the exchange only reminded her of that moment in court years ago, when silence turned the room in her favor. The instinct returned like muscle memory. She knew exactly how to handle him. When Patel finally leaned forward, eyes narrow, and spat out that single word, liar, the room gasped. Crockett didn't move. She didn't raise her voice or rush to defend herself. She simply watched him with the calm of someone who had already decided how this story would end. That quiet strength, forged over years of being underestimated, became the most powerful response imaginable. Because silence wasn't surrender, it was the sound of preparation. And while Patel basked in the noise he had created, Crockett was already planning the end of it. When Patel called her a liar, Crockett didn't flinch. She prepared to end the noise with evidence. The air in the hearing room was thick enough to touch. What began as routine questioning had turned into a spectacle that felt more like a trial of temperaments than a policy debate. Kash Patel leaned into his microphone, voice sharpened by irritation. Each interruption hit like a jab. Each word delivered with the confidence of a man who'd never been told to stop talking. Answer the question, he snapped, before she'd even opened her mouth. His tone wasn't inquiry, it was accusation dressed as authority. Cameras zoomed in, capturing the friction like heat on film. Crockett looked up slowly, composed as ever, her pen still gliding across the page. "If you'd let me finish," she said evenly, her voice carrying the calm of control. That only provoked him further. "Don't deflect," Patel barked, gesturing wildly toward the committee chair, as if to summon backup. A few aides exchanged uneasy glances. The audience in the gallery leaned forward, caught between fascination and discomfort. Somewhere in the back, a journalist whispered to another, "He's losing it." The live stream chat exploded. Tweets poured in mid-sentence, clips, gifs, breathless captions. "She's unshakable. He's unraveling." On one network, a pundit typed furiously, "Classic Patel. Dominate or die trying." A commentator murmured, "She's not taking the bait." The split screen of the nation's reaction unfolded in real time. Millions of viewers picking sides while the exchange burned hotter. Crockett didn't blink. Every time he cut her off, she paused just long enough for the silence to feel heavy, then resumed as though uninterrupted. It was discipline disguised as patience. "Congressman," she began again, "facts don't need volume." The room shifted, small laughter from one corner, then hushes as Patel glared. The more he fumed, the smaller his authority became. He fired another question, this one barbed with insinuation. "So, are you denying the report, or are you just rewriting it?" His tone dripped with condescension. Crockett leaned slightly forward, her expression unreadable. "I'm clarifying what's true," she said. "That's what we're here for, right?" The words hung like smoke. The chair tried to move the session along, but the exchange had already stolen the show. The rhythm built, his voice rising, hers steady. He spoke in accusations. She answered in evidence. He sought reaction. She offered reason. With every clash, the contrast grew clearer. Emotion versus ethics, noise versus nuance. The audience could feel the power dynamic shifting, not through volume, but through control. Patel's gestures grew erratic. Crockett's stillness became command. Aides whispered, phones buzzed, pundits on panels prepped instant analyses. One anchor said later, you could almost see the realization hit him, that the louder he got, the smaller he looked. It was theater, yes, but theater with consequence. And Crockett was writing the final act without saying a word more than necessary. Patel tried one last push, reaching for his signature move, a personal jab meant to unnerve. "Maybe you're confused," he said with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "Maybe the facts aren't as solid as you think." The sentence was meant to humiliate. Instead, it revealed desperation. Crockett met his gaze, unflinching. The silence that followed was deafening. Every insult chipped away at his composure. Every calm response amplified hers. You could feel the audience's loyalty shifting with each exchange, empathy magnetized toward dignity. What began as a confrontation had become a study in restraint, a reminder that control is the quiet twin of strength. For a heartbeat, even Patel sensed it. The air conditioner hummed. Papers rustled faintly. Cameras panned from his clenched jaw to her folded hands. He had played his final card. The performance was unraveling, the script collapsing. Then, without haste, Jasmine Crockett reached for a single folder. The sound of the clasp clicking open echoed through the room. Conversations stopped mid-whisper. Patel's grin faltered. She placed the folder on the table, opened it with care, and looked up. The tension thickened until even the journalist forgot to breathe. And in that suspended moment, between noise and revelation, the room fell silent. The folder opened with a soft, deliberate rustle, barely audible, yet it sliced through the tension like a bell tolling the start of something irreversible. Inside was not chaos, not conjecture, but order. Color-coded tabs, timestamps, copies of verified records, every sheet a quiet refutation. Every fact a small, sharpened blade. Crockett slid the first document forward. "For the record," she began, voice calm enough to be unnerving, "this is the communication timeline from the agency you've cited." Her tone carried no accusation, no theatrics, just authority wrapped in restraint. Patel leaned back, trying to reclaim his smirk, but his eyes flicked down to the page as the monitors displayed the evidence. The timeline contradicted his claim word for word. She continued, unhurried. "You stated earlier that the report was fabricated." Another tab flipped. "However, this is the Inspector General's confirmation. Signed, dated, and entered into the public record 2 weeks before your statement." Low murmurs spread through the room. Reporters' pens stopped midair. Patel adjusted his tie, then the microphone, then his posture. That's not the full context," he stammered, reaching for the same swagger that had carried him through years of talk shows, but it wasn't working. Context was no longer his ally. The facts had locked him in. Crockett looked at him, not to gloat, but to clarify. "So you're suggesting the Inspector General lied?" she asked softly. The question wasn't a trap. It was a mirror. Patel opened his mouth, but the words faltered. The silence that followed was heavy enough to hum. The narrator's voice would later describe it best. It wasn't anger that destroyed him. It was precision. Crockett kept going. Exhibit after exhibit. Statements he'd made on television replayed against documents that disproved them. His own signatures contradicted his narrative. The committee screens flickered with dates, sources, and verifiable proof. She didn't raise her voice once. Her power came from the rhythm of certainty. The cadence of someone who knew truth didn't need dramatics to be devastating. Patel tried to interrupt, to regain footing. "You're twisting this," he said, his tone cracking on the last word. Crockett didn't look up from her papers. "No, Congressman," she replied, steady as a heartbeat. "I'm reading it." The audience felt the shift, the turning of a tide long overdue. Even those who had entered skeptical found themselves leaning forward, drawn into the spectacle of composure dismantling bravado. Cameras zoomed in on Patel's face, the flush creeping upward, the forced grin collapsing under the weight of documentation. Across social media, the moment erupted. Clips were posted within minutes. She brought receipts, literal receipts. Hashtag receipts, DONT, lie, trending #1. On TikTok, users layered slow-motion edits of her sliding papers across the table, soundtracked by cinematic strings. Twitter, now called X, lit up with memes and disbelief. She just ended a man's career with a binder. But inside the room, it was deadly serious. Crockett moved to her final piece of evidence, a signed statement that directly refuted Patel's central accusation. "And this," she said, tapping the page lightly, "is the agency's own acknowledgement that your claim was false. Entered into record, publicly accessible, verified by your office's correspondence." The chair asked if Patel wanted to respond. He leaned into the microphone, forced a laugh that didn't land. "Well, I suppose interpretations differ," he muttered, looking anywhere but at her. His eyes darted to the gallery, to the cameras, to the floor, anywhere that might offer an escape. But there was none. The performance had run out of script. Crockett closed the folder slowly. "Interpretations," she said. "Don't rewrite facts." Wasn't a punchline, it was punctuation. The sound of the clasp clicking shut reverberated like a gavel. For a long second, no one moved. Even the chair hesitated before clearing his throat. The hearing continued mechanically, but everyone knew the climax had passed. The energy in the room shifted completely. Patel's voice, when it returned, was smaller. He spoke less, deferred more. The swagger that had defined him dissolved into politeness. Crockett, meanwhile, simply returned to listening, her calm restored. her work done. Outside the chamber, the story metastasized. Clips looped on every platform. Commentators replayed the sequence: accusation, silence, evidence, collapse. Editorials called it a masterclass in restraint and the end of an era of empty outrage. Supporters flooded her mentions with pride and gratitude. Immigrant families posted messages like, "My daughter watched this twice. She said she wants to be calm like her." For Patel, the fallout was instant and merciless. Old interviews resurfaced, juxtaposed against the documents Crockett presented. Late-night hosts mocked the irony of a man undone by the very receipts he had ignored. Even his allies grew quiet, issuing vague statements about respecting the process. The machine that had once amplified his every word now hummed with avoidance. Crockett, however, didn't celebrate. She left the building without fanfare. The same calm she'd carried in, now edged with quiet relief. To her, it wasn't a victory lap. It was a necessary correction. She'd simply held a mirror up to power and let the truth do the rest. Still, she understood what had happened in that room went beyond one confrontation. It was symbolic, a cultural exhale, a reminder that integrity, though quieter, still carries farther than noise. Later that night, as networks played the clip on repeat, a single phrase echoed across screens and comment sections alike. It wasn't anger that destroyed him. It was precision. But the story didn't end there. The ripples had only begun to spread. Across media, across politics, across the fragile ecosystem of reputation that lived online. The applause would fade, but consequences don't vanish with headlines, because outside the hearing, the fallout was just beginning. The clip spread like wildfire. Before dawn, it had crossed from political Twitter to mainstream Instagram Reels, stitched into TikToks with captions like, "How to end a man's career without raising your voice." Edits slowed the moment she closed the folder, replayed the look on Patel's face, froze the instant of realization when arrogance met accountability. Someone paired it with orchestral music. Another, with gospel harmonies. The message was clear. Calm had conquered chaos. Cable news picked it up next. Morning shows framed it as a moment of moral theater, one commentator said. "It's not just that she proved him wrong. It's that she refused to lose herself doing it." Another called it a turning point in how we talk about truth. Within hours, hashtags dominated every platform. Hashtag receipts, DONT lie. Hashtag Crockett vs Patel. Hashtag Grace Under Fire. On YouTube, reaction videos flooded timelines. Political analysts paused every frame like film critics dissecting a masterpiece. "Watch her eyes," one said. "That's discipline. That's someone who came prepared for this exact storm." The comments filled with admiration. She didn't just win. She redefined what winning looks like. This is what dignity under pressure means. Late-night hosts couldn't resist. One joked, Patel called her a liar, and she responded with the Library of Congress. Laughter echoed across the audience, but beneath the humor was a sense of catharsis. The moment felt bigger than politics. It was cultural, emotional, generational. For millions watching, it was the rare scene where truth actually landed a punch. Meanwhile, Patel went into defense mode. His team released statements claiming he was misrepresented and that context was missing. But the internet had already decided. Screenshots of his past interviews circulated next to Crockett's documentation. Every denial spawned new memes. One read, "Context can't save you from receipts." His allies, once loud in their praise, grew conspicuously silent. Invitations dried up. Panels he once dominated replaced him with others willing to bring the facts. The political machine that had once amplified him began to grind to a halt, whispering instead of roaring. Inside his circles, the conversation shifted from loyalty to damage control. No one wanted to be the next casualty of documentation. It wasn't just a career wound, it was reputation decay, broadcast in real time. But for Jasmine Crockett, the storm looked different. To her supporters, she'd become a symbol, not of aggression, but of grace under siege. Clips of her composure played beside quotes from Maya Angelou, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and Michelle Obama. Teachers showed the exchange in civics classes. Activists called it a masterclass in quiet power. Parents told their kids, "This is how you win without shouting." For Crockett herself, the attention was disorienting. She hadn't come for viral glory. She'd come to defend truth, to make their record clear. Watching herself trend felt strange, almost detached. "I didn't end a career," she told a reporter days later. "I just corrected a lie." But the internet doesn't deal in modesty. It deals in symbols. And she had become one. There was vindication in the air. Yes, but also disbelief, a collective exhale after years of noise and spin. Viewers around the country said the same thing in comment threads and community posts. Finally, someone stood up with dignity. It wasn't about left or right. It was about the hunger to see decency rewarded. Even Patel's critics admitted, privately, that they hadn't expected the fallout to be this swift, this total. The irony was poetic. The man who'd built his image on controlling, Narratives had lost it all to one woman's poise and a folder of facts. By the week's end, Crockett's calm stare was on magazine covers, her quote, "Interpretations don't rewrite facts." Printed across t-shirts and digital banners, students used it in debate clubs. Commentators called it the line of the year. And somewhere in the noise, the deeper story began to surface. Not just about politics, but about the power of restraint. About how truth, when delivered without venom, carries a resonance arrogance can't drown out. The public had chosen a side, yes, but what they'd really chosen was a principle. That integrity is not weakness, and calm is not surrender. As the memes multiplied and the headlines spun, one truth remained steady. The sound that had ended the argument wasn't shouting. It was the quiet click of a folder closing. Yet for Jasmine Crockett, victory wasn't about humiliation. It was about a principle larger than politics. When the frenzy finally began to fade, the world was left with echoes, not of Patel's accusation, but of Crockett's composure. The storm had passed, the hashtags cooled, yet one image lingered in the nation's mind: a woman at a table, still as stone, holding her ground with nothing but truth and patience. It was a rare moment when the spectacle of politics gave way to the substance of character. In her first full interview after the hearing, Jasmine Crockett sat beneath soft studio lights, posture calm, voice measured. When asked how she kept her composure in the face of provocation, she smiled gently. "Facts don't need volume," she said. "They just need daylight." The interviewer paused, visibly moved. It wasn't a soundbite. It was a philosophy. For a culture addicted to outrage, her words felt like an antidote. Commentators replayed them on air, calling them the line that redefined political grace. But for Crockett, it wasn't about redefining anything. It was about remembering something America once prized: the power of dignity. She'd seen her parents work hard in quiet ways that changed lives. She'd been underestimated before, dismissed before, and every time she'd learned the same lesson: you don't have to shout to be heard if what you're saying is true. The narrator's voice would echo the sentiment. In an age where noise masquerades as strength, composure has become rebellion. The image of Crockett that circulated across the internet wasn't just viral, it was symbolic. She became the embodiment of a forgotten ideal. Courage can whisper and still be thunder. Journalists began referring to the moment as the reckoning of the folder, a shorthand for truth reclaiming its place in the public square. Editorials used it as a case study in restraint. Civic leaders cited it in speeches about accountability. Even political opponents grudgingly acknowledged that she'd handled the confrontation with uncommon discipline. The narrative had transcended partisanship. It wasn't about sides anymore. It was about standards. The symbolism was undeniable. Crockett's act, one woman, one folder, one voice, had become a beam of light cutting through the fog of disinformation. It reminded people that clarity doesn't need chaos to be powerful. Truth, when presented plainly, can still pierce through the noise that tries to bury it. In classrooms and community halls, people began discussing the hearing not as political theater, but as moral example. Teachers used it to talk about integrity. Mentors shared it as proof that civility isn't weakness. Parents told their kids, "See, that's how you stand tall without shouting." Crockett herself resisted the hero narrative. "I just did my job," she said more than once. But the humility only deepened her impact. Because in a time when self-promotion was currency, her quiet deflection felt revolutionary. It wasn't the volume of her voice that changed the tone of the room. It was the consistency of her values. For Patel, the noise that had once defined him grew quieter. For Crockett, the calm that had once been underestimated became her armor. The moral revealed itself through contrast. Arrogance exhausts itself. Truth sustains. And so the story settled into memory, not as scandal, but as signal. A reminder that democracy still depends on the courage to remain calm when others demand chaos. That dignity, though unfashionable in a shouting age, still carries the most enduring power of all. The narrator closes. In the end, it wasn't just a hearing. It was a reflection of who we are when tested. A nation paused, looked in the mirror, and remembered, integrity still matters. And as the cameras dimmed, one message remained. Integrity still matters in the echo that followed. One truth stood tall. Power isn't found in the loudest voice. It's found in the calm that refuses to break. The story of Jasmine Crockett wasn't just about politics. It was about principle. It showed us that facts, when delivered with courage and grace, can still pierce the fog of distortion. In an era of constant outrage, she reminded a nation that composure is not silence, it's control. So here's the challenge. In a world addicted to noise, be the voice of clarity. When someone twists the truth, respond with evidence. When anger tempts you to shout, answer with purpose. Every share, every conversation, every moment of integrity becomes another light in the dark, another refusal to let deception define the discourse. If this story moved you, share it. Let it travel farther than the lies ever could. Let it stand as proof that calm conviction still wins. Subscribe to keep truth visible, because the world doesn't need more chaos. It needs more courage, more calm, more people who refuse to bend to the volume of arrogance. And remember this, when lies echo, truth must thunder.